Here to discuss the book with Becca tonight is Amanda Silverman. She's the Features and Investigations Editor at MIT Technology Review. She was previously the Newsroom Editorial Director at Mother Jones, and we're thrilled to have her here. Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. And the star of the evening, Becca Andrews, is a journalist at Recon News. She writes about reproductive rights and gender, formerly covering those beats for Mother Jones. She's a graduate of UC Berkeley School of Journalism. Before attending school there, she wrote for newspapers in her home state of Tennessee. Her work has been published in Wired, Jezebel, Rolling Stone, among others. I just want to say, personally, we've had the pleasure of hosting Becca a handful of times over the years. I've been looking forward to this evening for years, and I'm so thrilled that we get to gather together in person to celebrate Becca and No Choice. If y'all also are excited about that, please make some noise to help welcome Becca Andrews.
Sorry, I'm short.
Well, I'm also so excited to be here. As many of you familiar faces know, I worked with Becca for a long time at Mother Jones, and remember when Becca pitched the initial story that became the backbone of this book. I think it's chapter 8, maybe.
That sounds right.
Yeah. And so I remember Becca kind of like bought some plane tickets, flew overnight to Mississippi, and you'll have to read the book to find out what happened next. But from there, Becca started on this journey for the book, so I'm so glad. The news is not great, but Becca's book is great. So
Appreciate that.
yeah. So I want to start where you started in the book, which is you have this. You started the statement that says, "For 23 years, I was vehemently anti-abortion," and I feel like, at least for people who don't know you, that will surprise some readers, given that what they're kind of anticipating going into. Can you talk about the decision to start the book that way?
Yeah. I mean, so I think that all journalists come from a place of bias, right? Like, we have our own experiences, we have our lives that have shaped the way that we look at the world. So I wanted to kind of get that out of the way and be really frank with readers about where I'm coming from. I also wanted to establish that, like, I remember what it's like to be on the other side of that. And I feel like I hope that I handle the other side with empathy and care as well. So I kind of just wanted to be like, okay, that was my world, and here I am writing this book, and it's a plot twist that I did not see coming, nor did my parents.
Yeah, you write early on that this book is for people of all backgrounds and all belief systems, and you explicitly say it's for pro-life people. How did you kind of think about that in the way you were writing? Did you feel like keeping that audience in mind changed your approach?
Maybe a little. I know maybe it's not popular these days, but I'm a very earnest person. So I tried to write this really earnestly and in a way that's kind of clear-eyed and cuts through the bullshit a little bit. I didn't want it to be quite so snarky, although, like, there's a little snark in there.
There are definitely a couple Becca-isms.
They're a little. I am who I am, Amanda, as you know. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to put all of the information out there. And above all, I wanted to stay true to the characters in the book. I wanted to really show who these people are and be true to their stories.
And I'll keep using this pro-life term for now, that we can talk about that too. But has anyone who identifies as pro-life had an interesting response to the book that they've told you about? Not like trolling, but like somebody who's really kind of engaged with you on this.
It hasn't been so overt, I guess, but the preacher of my parents' church, from the scene in the introduction, reached out to me and was like, "Hey, congratulations on the book," and like didn't really say anything beyond that, but I thought it was a big enough deal. I just like didn't push. I was like, "Thank you, like so glad y'all are doing well," you know.
And that he recognized that it came out.
Yeah, so that was heartening. That.
So I want to talk about these terms, pro-life, that I'm using kind of for ease here, and I'll probably use pro-choice for ease as well. And you talk a lot about language in the book and the power of the word abortion.
Okay.
Becca has very
Yeah, good reflexes.
Right.
And we've also talked a lot about kind of how layered the word abortionist is. How did you sort of approach the book and kind of tackle these gulfs of understanding in our language? And like, did you feel like you had to make very like deliberate decisions early on to connect with people? And then maybe also worth just like telling everyone here a little bit more about like the decisions you made, particularly on the pro-life and pro-choice labels, and why that's complicated.
Yeah, so I think the book for me too was an opportunity to get into that language. Being a writer, I am a language nerd, so it was fun to sort of like dig into these ways that we describe each other and the way that we describe human beings, and how quick it is, and there's not a lot of nuance, right? There's not a lot of space for actually getting into what those beliefs look like. So I wanted the opportunity to really dissect it. So I refer to people in the book as pro-life when they refer to themselves as pro-life, and then in the introduction when I'm sort of starting to play with those terms and to introduce them. I do have a little bit of a parenthetical in the first part of the book where I say, I do take issue with the words pro-life because it begs the question of whose life we're valuing there. And, so there's a chapter in the book that's called The Abortionist. And I wanted to sort of take apart the stigma of the term abortionist and the stigma of the term abortion. And there's just a lot there historically. Those words carry a lot of weight, and some people are comfortable with them and some aren't. And I just kind of wanted to get into it.
And that, that makes me think about We Testify, which, if you're not familiar, is an organization that shares and emphasizes and highlights stories of abortion and really emphasizes using the word abortion, has pressured Joe Biden to use the word abortion.
He finally did it, y'all. He finally used the word abortion.
Could you talk a little bit about that framework as you were approaching women and thinking about the power of their stories? You're talking about staying true to the characters. Some of these women have never told their stories before. Like, how did you kind of approach that with care and think about the importance of that storytelling?
Yeah, so the activists in the book are all about using the word abortion just like you would use the word of any other medical procedure. And it's a way of kind of trying to erase the stigma and speak about it in plain medical terminology. You'll see there are some characters in the book who have had abortions and they don't feel comfortable with the word. There's one character who talks about releasing her pregnancy instead of the word abortion, and talks about how the word abortion feels heavy in her mouth. And I think there's such a different people who have experienced that and are coming from different positions of power and privilege. Their stories are theirs. They get to claim it and talk about it in whatever terms they're most comfortable with. That's obviously like not the role that activists play. Activists play this role in like trying to educate people about their cause, and they feel like embracing the word abortion is important for that. For me as a writer, as neither an activist nor someone who's had an abortion, I wanted to just really clearly stay true to the stories of the people that I was telling. So you'll find I do use the word abortion quite a bit through the book, which was kind of annoying after a while. It's like, is there any other word that I could use here? Because it's feeling redundant, but kind of it is what it is. So,
and on a more practical level, how did you find your characters, especially if some of these people had never told their story before?
Weirdly, a lot of the pre-Roe stories, and those are mostly the folks who hadn't told anyone before, came from a call out on Twitter, which I didn't expect. It was just, it was in the early days of trying to report the book. The pandemic had just started.
One good thing from Twitter.
Yeah, one good thing from Twitter. And I was like, that, I'm stuck at home. Like, there's really nothing I can do about it. So I'm just going to tweet this and see what happens. And I got a lot of folks that way. Others, it's the classic journalists, like, you talk to one person and then you're like, who else should I talk to that you know? And that obviously like beget more characters that way. The other thing too is that I've been on this beat for a long time. I've been on this beat for almost 7 years. So I have developed sources through that time, and people have learned to trust me. Hopefully I have earned that trust and handled their stories with respect here. But I think that also went a really long way, because recently, as the news has shifted, you see a lot of reporters kind of like trying to jump into this beat. And I think folks in abortion rights are really reluctant to kind of open up to more people and take on that. So I'm glad that I've been on this beat for as long as I have in this moment.
You're trying to talk about some of these stories from pre-Roe, and like you have a lot of like, you have like ancient Greek history in the book. Like you go back, it goes deep.
I nerded out really hard.
I'm curious specifically about the like when abortion started becoming a moral issue, and I think that a lot of people are probably still surprised that it wasn't always considered a moral issue. And kind of can you talk a little bit more about what you found there, and like what happened with that pivot, and maybe if there's anything there that surprised you?
Yeah. So spoiler alert, it's all about power. So broadly, and the book gets into more nuance, but broadly what happened is reproductive care was something that was done within communities, usually by midwives who were kind of taking care of their own people. As medicine became more professionalized, men in particular were using that as a way to gain both like cultural power and economic power. So outlawing abortion was also a way to sort of get the midwives out of the way so that they could take that clientele by painting them as dangerous. So that's kind of the first big major shift we see. And then the second is the Comstock Act, which sort of brings abortion in under indecency laws, and something that we should feel icky about and uneasy with. And then from there, it just kind of spiraled out with the Catholic Church and then the Evangelical Church, and here we are.
Another key part of this history is how it's women of color in particular have been disproportionately targeted and attacked. And you have you have one chapter at the very beginning that is very kind of brutal, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm curious why you decided to put that so early in the book, but also you talk about how we might never know so many stories here, or we just won't know so many stories here because of who gets to tell history, right?
Right.
And so how did you think about bridging those gaps, and how can we like better understand this fragmented history?
I wanted to be really forthright about what I know and what I don't know and what I can't know. So, the chapter that Amanda is talking about goes into history of, enslaved Black women in this country and the ways that they sort of fought to hold on to their reproductive autonomy when they could, the history of Indigenous women and the ways that they lost reproductive autonomy when colonial settlers arrived, and how that continued on. So, but it's hard, right? Because these are people who are systemically, purposefully disempowered, and who were not allowed to tell their stories, were not allowed the means to tell their stories, were not part of the dominant language. So much of it has been lost to history, sometimes purposefully destroyed, sometimes purposefully erased. And I wanted to be very forthright that I am, not only am I, stepping into this role of historian, trying to pull that apart and not finding it, but also I don't come from any of those traditions. So I don't have the cultural ability to speak into it either. But I think it is important to talk about the loss that comes with that, the loss of those stories, and how there are these huge swaths of history and massive harm that's been done that we're just never going to know the full extent of.
Just to pivot a little bit, but still sticking to mostly pre-Roe history, though some after, there's this recurring image in the book of the waiting room. And it sort of connects various people's experiences throughout the book. And, you know, like there's one example in 1968 where a woman travels to Juarez. In the 70s, someone goes from Ohio to New York. And then later in the 90s, I believe, a teenager goes to Wichita to see Dr. Tiller, who famously was murdered. And they all talk about this scene with you where they're kind of seeing other young women in the waiting room and no one knows each other. No one's really talking to each other. And it seems like they've all really remembered that. Did you pick up on that? And like, how did you kind of piece that together when you were writing, when you were hearing these various stories?
Okay, this is my favorite question that I've ever been asked about the book. So Amanda wins. Yes, that's something that was really striking to me as, you know, this group of people, they're all sharing the same experience. They're all sort of going through the same thing, but stigma keeps them from talking to each other, right? Like they're all sort of mired in their own shame. Often it sounded like to me, hearing them tell their stories. So like they felt in some ways one of the women was talking about how listening to the people around her, it sounded like most of them still thought abortion should be outlawed, which is like, but like we're all here. So I kind of wanted to get at the irony of that feeling of isolation in a crowded room, and it just like kept coming up, and I think it really speaks to the power of abortion stigma.
And many of these networks pre-Roe were also quite secretive. Mm-hmm. I think even one of these examples, she didn't even know the network that was helping her get to Mexico, I believe. Yeah. Or the name of it. And I think if anybody has heard about these pre-Roe networks, it's probably Jane. I would guess there was an HBO documentary. But Jane was not alone. There was Society for Humane Abortion, the Clergy Consultation Service, among others that I probably don't know myself. And I'm curious why you think that these histories have been largely forgotten.
Also a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think sexism. So I think that this history has not been valued because it is so specific to women. So, you know, it was shocking to me, especially delving into the Society for Humane Abortion and Pat McGinnis, that not everyone knows who she is, because she's just like as a writer, she's the character that you dream of coming across.
I feel like you have to tell everybody a little about Pat.
Oh man,
I'm obsessed with Pat.
Pat's so great. So Pat is this activist. She really started her activism in Oakland, California. And eventually she started this network that sent people seeking abortion out of the country, mostly to Mexico, to providers that she and her two friends vetted. She grew up Catholic. She's one of those people that just like says whatever the hell she thinks. Like it just comes out of her mouth. There's no filter, no nothing. She's very unapologetic about abortion at a time that it was really radical to be that way. And she was unapologetic about managing her own abortions. Pat should be in every history book as far as I'm concerned. Like, yeah. She really made a huge change. They helped thousands and thousands of women. The woman that I spoke to didn't know the name of the network that had helped her, didn't know about Pat really. So it was kind of cool to be able to put that history together with her help and to like hunt this down and then get really obsessed with the Society for Humane Abortion. I feel like I could have written a whole book on them. They're incredible. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that people don't know about this, right? So I think it's a product of stigma again, and then certainly of misogyny. We're not comfortable talking about women's bodies.
Yeah. Yes. And I mean, my next question was also just about Pat specifically, because I find her so fascinating. Not only was she managing her own abortions, and then she told the cops about it and was like,
yeah.
What are
She
you
was
gonna
like,
do?
I'll show you.
Yeah.
I'll show the courtroom.
But she and her peers were basically daring officers to arrest them. An officer was like, we'll arrest you if you teach a class here about how to get an abortion, like self-manage your own abortion. They're like, great, we're coming there.
On our way.
And I just keep thinking about that, like, radicalism, and will we or are we already seeing any of that today, but like in a different form that, like, I can't really put my finger on it. And I mean, you would know.
Yeah, I think we totally are. I think Renee Bracey Sherman at We Testify is a great example of this. She like says whatever the hell she thinks, and that's kind of that. Her campaign to get the president to say the word abortion, I thought was really powerful and effective because it finally worked. I've been really impressed with sort of smaller networks that I've found sprinkled throughout the South that are, they're groups of people who are teaching each other how to perform abortion care, both surgically, with pills, and herbally. So I think we will continue to see more of that, though I think medication abortion is certainly like the main way that we'll be seeing that manifest. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think the spirit of the activism that we saw pre-Roe is still very much alive and experiencing sort of a necessary renaissance right now.
Yeah. I want to come back to medication abortion, but I'm going to stick on some pre-Roe history for a bit because there's so much that I learned reading this. But like, I had never heard of the Clergy Consultation Service before, which was a network of religious figures who supported women getting abortions through a religious framework. And it's like, I can't even really square that in my mind anymore. Like, can you talk a little bit more about how, like, the religion and abortion, how that conversation has evolved, and like how I just like can't imagine something like that happening now.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it, right, is that American evangelicalism has sort of taken over our brains as the only form of religion when it's not. And it hasn't traditionally been either. So yeah, the CCS really challenged me too, particularly as someone who formerly identified as a Christian. They felt like providing abortion care was part of their calling to help the lost and the least. And I found it to be a really beautiful expression of faith. And, certainly they faced pushback from people who had different interpretations of the Bible and who felt abortion was wrong. But still, I'd love to see something like that in present day America. I feel less optimistic about that. But I do think that it's a good example of, like, far right evangelicalism is its own thing. It's not the end all be all of religion, and it's not even the end all be all of Christianity in this country. So there's that.
To pivot a little bit, this is sort of a language question, but it's maybe a bit broader too. You spend a lot of time in the book talking about the difference between the reproductive rights movement and the reproductive justice movement. And I think that's also something people don't often understand. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more about the two and why it's so important for us to really understand the meaningful differences between the two, particularly now.
Yeah. So the reproductive rights movement focuses largely on abortion rights. The reproductive justice movement came out of a meeting among Black women in the 90s. The group was called Sister Song, and they were talking about the need for abortion on like a larger spectrum of reproductive health care. So they're really looking at reproductive justice as a larger expression of bodily autonomy. So, the right to not have children, but also the right to have children and to have those children in healthy environments, and the children's right to clean drinking water and healthy food, and the right to maternal care. Like, it's all wrapped up together, and it's a much more holistic way of looking at, well, reproductive rights, I guess, if that's not confusing. But, the reason that there was a need for the reproductive justice movement is because the reproductive rights movement was so narrow and really was only meeting the needs of the upper middle class white women who felt like their right to abortion was threatened in the first place. But women of color were like, our lives are not quite that straightforward. Like there's more, the ways that we're experiencing medical care and the gaps affect us on like a larger scale.
Right.
I certainly find talking about abortion within a reproductive justice framework to be more satisfying and maybe even more like a little intellectually honest, because I don't really see a difference between the need to provide abortion care and the need for good maternal health care or, good birthing services. But that's the difference there, I guess.
That kind of leads into like your tour, I guess, of abortion clinics in the 2 or so years leading up to Dobbs. And I have to imagine some clinics kind of offered more of a spectrum of care, where and some other places just provided abortions. What was it like visiting these clinics, particularly during that time period where there's sort of just like this like tick, tick, tick in the back of many of these people's minds? Like a lot of these clinics are in the South or they're in the Midwest, where either there's already really heavy restrictions on the procedure, or they just like know that it's a matter of time. Like what was that experience like, and how did they keep like going?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I think I got a greater understanding of how difficult it is for clinic workers. They just have felt like there's this sword hanging over their heads that could fall at any moment for years now. And now it has fallen, and some of the clinics have closed. And going back to those people who have suddenly lost their jobs and are like, okay, what do I do with my life now? This was my entire life. Has been really heartbreaking. But also just seeing like the day-to-day stress and the day-to-day toll that takes was very sobering for me, particularly in the clinic in Wichita, which has seen, experienced what it means for their abortion provider to be murdered in church. Like, that's going to work every day with that knowledge, driving past people who actively support and visit the man who killed the doctor who used to work there. It's unimaginable, and they have to do these sort of mental gymnastics to be able to keep going, but there's sort of no other option. The work is that important to them.
So this clinic has been rebranded since Dr. Tiller was there, and it's now called Trust Women. Mm-hmm. And it's very notable that it's the only place in the book where you talk to anti-abortion protesters.
Yes.
And I'm curious both what that experience is like, and why you decided to include their voices in the book.
So I did talk to other anti-abortion protesters at clinics. It just didn't make it into the book. And the reason that this did was because it was so striking to me that the history was still so much a part of the present, and that when I started talking to people out there, I didn't know that these were people who were friends with the man who killed Dr. Tiller and who have...
And this was in 2009.
Right. Who have visited him in jail, continue to visit him. I will say putting that together after the interviews was a little...
Unsettling.
Quite unsettling, yeah, 100%. But I also was really struck by the depth of their conviction, right? Like, they really do believe that they're putting their bodies out there to stop murder. And I don't think that every anti-abortion person necessarily feels that so acutely, but like these people really, really did. And I thought that was really worth exploring on the page.
And like, you spend a lot of time with the clinic workers and providers at Trust Women, mm-hmm. and at some other clinics, and you already talked about the abortionist chapter, and you write with such empathy about what their like day to day is like. But there's this chapter that really struck me that I tried to excerpt in Mother Jones, which was that you weren't afraid to call out the shortcomings of of the way that many clinics, and in particular high profile national organizations, operate, kind of the infrastructure that we have now is inadequate. But for so long, abortion advocates have been very reluctant to call this out, and it's had to be kind of unimpeachable. Can you talk about like why you really wanted to do that in the book and why it's been such a fraught subject, and also just for people who haven't read the book yet too, like how it falls short?
Yeah, so that particular chapter was hard to write for a lot of different reasons. I think partly because I now am ardently pro-choice as well, so I understand the fear that pro-abortion folks have of like any little tiny failure could be weaponized by the other side, right? And could cost further access to abortion care. I mean, those are really high stakes. But I think, particularly as a journalist, that we do a disservice by not talking about those shortcomings and not talking about the ways that things can be better and not talking about abuses of power, particularly. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, I would just say like maybe the brief of where clinics both like aren't providing care that some people, particularly women of color and rural women, really need, and also like kind of how a lot of people's reflex is like, I'm going to donate to Planned Parenthood
right.
all of the time, but it's like there's other people on the ground here.
Yeah, and I think it was also about exploring the cost of restrictions, right? That if clinics are spending all of their time and resources jumping through hoops to meet all of these different restrictions that are passed by a state legislature that hasn't taken the time to really understand how they should be operating, that's going to affect their quality of care, right? Like, that's just a bandwidth problem. We can't do our best work if we're not equipped to do our best work. So I really wanted to show how that is affecting care, and that's affecting the lives of very real people. I also wanted to kind of call out the ways that abortion rights groups, namely Planned Parenthood, have gained a lot of cachet. They've gained a lot of money and a lot of power. And I'm still trying to figure out how to write about that as a journalist and hold that to account in ways that feel productive. And I also think it's an education thing, right? Like, I think people assume, oh, like abortion, like you were saying, abortion is in danger, I'm going to give money to Planned Parenthood, without realizing that, like, that's not money that's going to go to help individual people get abortion care. That's money that's going to go toward lobbying or staff expenses. And that's all fine and good, but I think there's just a fundamental misunderstanding in the general public about what that looks like versus giving money to a local abortion fund.
I hate to even think about the day that Dobbs came down.
Oh,
it was a dark day.
It was a dark day.
But I'd hope that you'll talk a little bit about how much changed that day, but also how much didn't. You have this one quote in the book where, like, could you talk about a little bit about like how one of these providers in the South that you were talking to had been like already wargaming what would happen, and then it came down. They're like, well, we already knew access was just going to be an issue, so we're already living it. Like,
yeah,
a lot changed, but a lot
didn't. I mean, yeah, I think a lot of groups spent so much time planning for the day that when it happened, it was kind of like, oh yeah, okay, we're here. But God, it was a terrible day. And the days since have also been terrible. There's sort of nothing like, I mean, certainly as a journalist, covering that and then also reckoning with my own loss of a fundamental human right. I live in Tennessee. Abortion is completely illegal in Tennessee. If I need an abortion, I have to leave the state or do it illegally. That's the reality for me. That's the reality for my community. That's the reality for my family. So I think there's been two things happening, right? Is like my understanding as a journalist and covering vulnerable populations, and then also my understanding as a human being and figuring out like what that looks like for my life. The actual day was rough. So Amanda and I were getting up very early every Supreme Court day, wondering if that was going to be the day. And I didn't think it was going to be the day, and you did. And then it was.
I don't think I win anything good for that.
You don't win anything good for that, no. But you were right, so you get the satisfaction, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, it was. I drove out to the Planned Parenthood in Nashville, and also talked to protesters, and kind of stood back and just watched them celebrate the moment. And that was really sobering for me. Yeah, certainly like covering the fallout since has been quite difficult emotionally, seeing people turned away in real time who are actually desperate, like seeing the look of desperation on people's faces, is something that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life.
I've already brought this up to you before, but you don't talk a ton about medication abortion in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote a piece for Mother Jones shortly after that. I can't remember the headline, but I remember the art. It wouldn't, about how medication was not going to solve everything.
Yeah.
But afterwards, so many people, after Dobbs came down, was like, oh, we have pills. Things will be okay.
Right.
Can you talk about the role that pills will play and kind of the limits of medication abortion and why it's not kind of the silver bullet that some people think it is?
Yeah. I think we used silver bullet in the headphone, in the headline, not headphone, headline, microphone. Yeah. So let's start macro, right? So medication abortion is a huge technological innovation, right? It completely changes the game from what things were like before Roe v. Wade to present. Now there are ways of getting pills in the mail, even illegally, at least that's a possibility, right? My thing with medication abortion is that, particularly as someone who grew up in the rural South, I don't see my community being at ease with that kind of care. So like if you grow up and you don't have basic sex education, you don't have basic reproductive health care, you don't have basic access to a gynecologist, you don't know how to talk about the parts of your body and like how your body works, it's a really big leap to go from that to managing your own abortion. The other thing that I think about is being from a small town, everyone's kind of like in each other's business, and like that has its ups and downs. But like if I had ordered abortion pills from India and the mailman had like brought a little package for me from India, like he would have asked me about it because that would have been weird, right? So I think that the people that are sort of touting medication abortion as the end all be all often live in bigger cities, often have access to that healthcare, and don't really understand the disconnect there. So, and I also think that, now that abortion is illegal in some places, that doesn't mean that we should just, have people do what it takes and not have any respect for their own autonomy, right? Like people should still be able to make the decisions of how they want to either self-manage their abortions or if they want to like go to a clinic or, I think agency is really important to talk about too. Some people aren't going to be comfortable with medication abortion. And though medication abortion is very safe and very effective, we do talk about it really casually. It's talked about like, oh, you take a pill and then like your problem's gone. And bodies are different, right? Like that looks different in every body. And medication abortion, self-managing abortion can also be very hard and very painful. And I think because we don't talk about that side of it, it starts to happen. And then the person who's self-managing is like, oh my God, am I dying? Like, do I need to go to a hospital? What is this supposed to look like? So I also think it's important to talk about the different ways that it can look.
Yeah. I feel like this sets up my last question, and then I'll see what everybody else wants to ask you. But you repeat a few times in the book that Roe is the floor, not the ceiling.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm hoping you can help us understand exactly what you mean by this and why we really need to keep that in mind, particularly given our current politics.
Right. So Roe was good. Roe did not meet the needs of everybody. Roe was a ruling that was really rooted in right to privacy. And we know, living in a country that fundamentally applies these rights unequally, that some people have a greater right to privacy than others, right? So that was never going to be applied to everyone the way that it should have been. I think the thing that I'm holding on to in this moment is that I'm not one of those people who is like, oh, like Roe should fall and then we can start over or whatever. But now that it has, I do think that there is an opportunity to hopefully build something better and something that's more inclusive and something that takes into account, you know, the disparities in healthcare in this country and the racism of our medical system. So that's kind of the thing that I'm just holding on to for dear life.
I don't know if I call that an optimistic note
It's
to end
not.
on.
It's not.
But it's as close as we're going to get right now, I think.
Sorry, y'all.
No.
It is what it is.
All right. I want to hear what you guys want to ask.
Yeah, who's got a question?
Madison.
Thank you. Hi, Becca.
Hey.
I was wondering if you could talk about, as somebody who's such an empathetic and compassionate and detail-oriented portrait artist of the people in your book, how you think about when you're approaching each of these profiles of them in the different chapters, what you owe your sources, and if there were any moments where you felt like your role as a journalist, as opposed to somebody who clearly identifies very much with the movement that you're writing about, you kind of have a foot in both worlds. If there were any hard decisions that you had to make about, I don't think the person I'm writing about is going to exactly like this, but it's important to include anyway.
That's a good question. So I think with abortion stories in particular, I wanted to make sure that the people that I was talking to felt like they had agency over their own stories and ownership. I didn't want them to feel like I was taking their stories and making it mine, because that's gross. So, you know, there was one person in the book who's a pre-Roe person who had like more to her story, and she's older and had forgotten that she had told me all the things that she told me, and like panicked and was very, very upset and was like, I'm not ready for that to be out there. And I totally could have been like, oh, well, I'm a journalist and you said it on the record so I can print it. But that's really shitty. And I didn't want to do that to her. So I just took it out, even though it sucked, even though I really liked the depth that I felt like it added to the story. It's not my story, it's hers. I mean, probably the anti-abortion folks that I write about maybe didn't love everything that I wrote about them. But at the same time, I do feel like it was pretty clear-eyed, and I did try to do follow-ups with them, and my requests went unanswered, so I just kind of had to like do what I had to do with that. But overall, you know, I also was thinking about power and privilege and the ways that journalism traditionally has been about like, oh, like you go, you do whatever it takes to get the story, you come back, you print it, you move on to the next thing. The book felt like an opportunity to sort of further turn that on its head, because I had time to really get to know people and work with them and be like, you know, look, this is what this means. And certainly some of them probably got annoyed with me calling them 30 different times to ask insane detailed questions. But I think overall people appreciate that I just cared that much about their story. I hope that's how they felt.
Should I see a hand over here?
That was a great conversation. I learned a ton. I'm excited to read the book. I'm curious, you mentioned how you're now living in a state where abortion is completely illegal. And I just wonder sort of if you've had any interesting conversations being the person who's written that book, living in that community, and what that's been like.
Yeah. In Tennessee, especially now, I'm the abortion friend. So like if someone has questions about abortion, I'm just the person that they call now. But I also have had a lot of conversations with other women who are my age who are like, okay, like I want to have a kid. I don't want to get pregnant and then something go wrong and then have to sort of be with a doctor who has to decide whether it's his license or my life, you know? So, you know, I know of people who are like packing up and leaving because of that, which is very fair. But yeah, it has like changed fundamentally, I think, in my community, what it means to be someone who has reproductive capabilities.
I feel like people don't talk about that enough.
I agree.
It's like, it's not just people who they want abortion in that moment.
Yeah,
It's people who want to get pregnant ever.
Yes.
I'm also very much looking forward to reading the book. And I wanted to talk more or hear more from you about the floor versus ceiling metaphor. And maybe you can talk more about what the ceiling could look like. You know, you mentioned, you know, things beyond just basic access to care, but also overcoming stigma and all these other things. You know, what can we dream of beyond just getting that basic right back?
Well, so first of all, please know that I'm not a policy expert, because otherwise I'd be doing something other than writing. But yeah, I mean, I think that I certainly dream of a world where no one is imprisoned or criminalized for either providing abortion care or getting it. Of a world where abortion is covered by insurance, like it's just another medical procedure, because it is, where insurance isn't something that you get based on where you work or like how much money you make. It's just something that you have because it's a human right to not be sick, you know, like really, really basic things. I mean, it's frustrating, right? Because it feels like it shouldn't be this hard. Like sometimes it feels so obvious, right? It's like we should just be able to care for each other the way that we're meant to. But yeah, I guess that's my like cheesy.
Can you explain like also the brief distinction between Roe being rooted in a right to privacy versus a protected right to abortion?
Yes. So this is the thing that Justice Ginsburg talked about a lot. She felt like there should have been a case that came before the court that really established abortion as its own constitutional right, not rooted in a separate constitutional right. So if abortion is recognized by the United States as a human right, then it stands on its own, right? It doesn't rely on other frameworks, so it's less shaky. There's direct support for it, right? And that's the difference. I'm trying to think if there's something else that I meant to say to that. I think that's it.
First of all, thank you. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I think a lot about like Gen Z and the younger generations, and I get super worried for them. Like, I remember being a teenager and trying to like delete my internet history, and I didn't know how. I was like, oh, they're gonna find my live journal, but now it has so much more weight. Like, yes, you have a ton of access to information through the internet, but then privacy is a huge part of that. Like, did that come up in any conversations about like how people can safely find information on the internet and not worry about their privacy with that?
Yeah, I mean, I worry less about Gen Z with that than I do our generation, and certainly the generation above us. Our generation in particular is really bad about privacy and like understanding how to protect our privacy. And maybe Gen Z is too, because they've grown up with the internet, so they're so putting their lives on the internet is kind of second nature. I think there have been a lot more efforts to educate people about digital privacy and ways to kind of cover your tracks. But I also think that a lot of Gen Z, and this is kind of separate from what you were asking, but I think they're really ballsy and they just kind of like say what they think, and they're really unapologetic about believing in human rights and equal access to abortion care. There are certainly Gen Z like anti-abortion folks out there, and there were at the Supreme Court the day that I went for oral arguments. But I don't know. Overall, I feel a lot of hope with this generation, and I do think they're very, very digitally savvy.
Hey, Becca.
Hey.
One of the things I really appreciated about the book was that it was fundamentally narrative driven, and it was people's stories, and it was history. And there wasn't a huge sort of like how-to or service element to it. And, you know, on Tuesday, we have the opportunity to vote here in California to put it in our state's constitution, at least. And wondering outside of the realm of policy, what sorts of interventions you've seen for people on the ground, individuals, to support people's right to abortion in this country besides going to the ballot box.
Yeah. There's a lot of really powerful direct mutual aid out there. Abortion funds, particularly in states where the landscape has been really hostile for a long time, are just doing whatever it takes to get patients where they can safely access care. I can't think of a more powerful thing to be doing. There are also, you know, obviously like lobbying efforts and things like that, and efforts to educate lawmakers about abortion and really just like basic ways that women's bodies work. But, you know, education can only go so far if the person is willing to listen or not. But yeah, I think the mutual aid is really powerful. I think particularly there are a lot of groups, especially in the South, and maybe I just say that because I'm from the South and so I'm just around it more, that are people who are coming out of the communities that need access the most and who are facing the biggest disparity. So, you know, groups that are led by queer women of color, queer people of color, low-income folks, indigenous people. Those are the people that I see who are doing really, really powerful, significant work. And if you have questions about who to donate to, I'm happy to talk about it.
Another question? Oh, yeah.
Becca, what do you envision as the future of Planned Parenthood in the movement going forward, given where we're at now and the dire state of need? What role should Planned Parenthood play, given that...
Are you a reporter?
I'm sorry. Given that for, you already have talked about, for so many people, they think abortion and it's synonymous with, oh, these rights are under threat, I should donate to Planned Parenthood.
Yeah. So to be clear, I don't think that Planned Parenthood is bad. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think they do a lot of good. I think they've done a lot of good. I think they will continue to do a lot of good. I do think that they have a lot of money. And I find myself wishing that I saw them taking more risks. And I hope that leadership in the future does allow for a little more risk because they can frankly afford it in ways that other groups can't. But yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, there's so much that everyone could be doing. And also, I don't work for Planned Parenthood, so I don't know what the full machine looks like.
Hi, Becca. I also look forward to reading the book.
You've read the book.
Yeah. So
Part of it, right?
most of it, mostly done. It's great. You all should get it and read it. So I think that when you're reporting on the South, and particularly about people who are staunchly anti-abortion, I think it's great that you emphasize that they believe that the reason that they're against it is because it's about a human life. And priority over their parents' life. But it's also intrinsically tied to religion. Something like 40% of Americans think that the earth is 6,000 years old, and those people are also all evangelicals. But the first third of your book spends a lot of time talking about people in the 50s, 60s, 70s who were religious, who supported access. Mm-hmm. Is there a similar group of religious people, and do they have any traction like that in the States today?
There are faith groups that also work in abortion rights. There are a lot of Jewish groups, but there are also people who identify as Christians. It's not quite as clear cut, I think, as what the clergy consultation service was doing. It's a little bit more like advocacy and less direct aid. But that's kind of all I know. I wish I knew more about it.
Another question? I feel like I saw some hands.
Thanks, y'all.
All right, well, let's show some more love for Becca Andrews. No Choice, United Davidson.